Okay, I'm just going to carry on because what is so significant is that this particular myth that you have just heard, along with the rest of the Old Testament, but this myth was particularly important, was appropriated by Henry VIII and with his Protestant agenda, and it played a huge role in the creation of the First Nation state, this myth. And if you're interested in looking it up, there's a brilliant articulation of it by a Sunday Times journalist, Clifford Longley, The Chosen People, and he just articulates really how the myth of Moses was very significant in terms of the emergence of the nation state, in terms of English isolation from Europe, which was what was articulated here. It played a huge role in the English Civil War, Cromwell's fight and the parliamentarians' fight against Charles I, which, as we'll find out next week, was to have huge implications in relation to Ireland as the parliamentarians and Cromwell, and this, by the way, that's Oliver Cromwell, and it played a big role in the overthrow of the monarchy of James II and what's called the mythology of the Glorious Revolution. It also, Clifford Longley argues, played a very significant role in terms of the separation of America from England, the American Civil War, and the American equivalent of the Canaanites, which of course was the American Indian, the indigenous people. So this myth, in a way, set out a formula, an operating hardwiring. So let us look at what the structure is. It begins with an oppressive captivity. So there is a people in an oppressive situation. And the first step in the journey is the escape from captivity. So you can see that any subsequent people who feel oppressed, this would be an attractive myth because it lays out what the formula is. What then happens, as we saw in the story that Fiona told, is there's a pursuit. The Pharaoh changes his mind and sets his army in pursuit of the Hebrews, the Israelites that have escaped. But as we know, there was miraculous help. And we saw in the parting of the Red Sea that miraculous intervention and I don't know whether the term is revenge, but the annihilation of Pharaoh's army. This God seems to have been extremely ruthless, generous to those on his side, but ruthless with anyone who was pursuing them. Then we have the wandering in the wilderness and the vision. The vision obviously is this promise of a promised land, which is the Canaan. And then we have the call. Moses is called up to the mountain and the encounter with this God, and it's only Moses who goes up. And we have this covenant, this deal that's done between God, and he confers on the Israelites' chosen people status. And we heard that, you will be my treasured possession. So, as I said earlier, the Protestants equated their situation with the Israelites. So they were the modern Israelites. So if Moses and his people were my treasured possession, the appropriation of this story implied that the English and the English Protestants were my treasured possession, my being God. And this establishes the structure of chosenness. And then he comes down and we have the law, and we have the 10 commandments. And it's interesting that the one commandment above all else that was all important, even above murder and theft, was idolatry. You could not have any other god, and we saw that in the breakup of the idol that the people in waiting had created. We then have the laws established, and what has emerged as a result of this chosenness is that a very clear structure of enemies emerges. And what emerges from this mythology is it's completely acceptable to treat the rest of humanity as it suits. And that, of course, is what we saw in the destruction of the Canaanites. And there is sanction there for massacre, enslavement, and what would nowadays be called genocide, but it is in the name of the Lord. And as a result, a new nation, a new faith, and a new destiny is established, and as a result of the wiping out of the indigenous people, who are the Canaanites. So this is the mythic structure, and a mythic structure that underlay a lot of English history in the 17th century, and indeed much of American history, because the same thing was appropriated. But I think there's one other thing that we need to look at, which is how this mythology was translated into a political playbook by one Thomas Cromwell, who we looked at and was mentioned very dramatically and powerfully last week. Now, he was the political genius behind behind Henry VIII, and it's extremely interesting. And I'm going to now we've run through the narrative structure of the chosen people, Moses' story, and now what we're going to run through is the myth maker's playbook, or the what might also be called the tyrant's playbook. So there are 8 steps in this. The first is that there needs to be clarity as to what you are trying to achieve, and in a way it's a sort of a new promised land. And in the case of Henry VIII, his new promised land was a land in which he could effectively get what he wanted, which was a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, so he could marry Anne Boleyn. He did have an exemplar. Thomas Cromwell had spent much of his early life after a brutal childhood. His father was a very violent man, but after that he went to Italy and came across Marsilio of Padua's Defensor Pacis, or Paxis, which idealizes the power and authority of the state over the church, which is very different from the Roman Catholic association with the church. But he had a model on which to work. Now, his way of effecting the change was legislative. He got his mind around the power of law and legislation. And he got the government to enact 2 sets of laws. In 1533, the Act of Restraint of Appeals was passed. Now, what this essentially meant was that this very Catholic country, England was a very devotional Catholic country, but what the Act of Restraint of Appeals did was separate the church from the church in England from the Roman church. And it meant that anyone who had a complaint could no longer appropriate canon law and appeal to Rome when there was a dispute. And the second thing he did was set up the act, or enact the Act of Supremacy, which gave primacy to the monarch over the church. This is called Erastianism. And having enacted these, he basically demanded an oath of loyalty to the king. And anyone who did not submit to the oath of loyalty was a tyrant and betrayed the state and was going to be punished. And that punishment was absolutely ruthless, absolutely brutal. It was to be hung, drawn, and quartered. So any teacher, any preacher, and particularly the famous people like Thomas More and Richard Reynolds, who were not willing to betray their original faith and show loyalty to this new legislative system that had just been introduced, were ruthlessly disposed of. And in terms of oral storytelling, you can imagine the effect on a nation if someone as highly revered as the great humanist Thomas More is hung, drawn, and quartered. It is going to go round the country like a bushfire. Everyone is going to hear of the horror and realize what the implications are for them. So the formula is new legislation, ruthless punishment for non-adherence, and that punishment enacted publicly. He then was the first master of mass disinformation. He was a propagandist. He ran a systematic campaign of what would now be called fake news. It was involving tracts, sermons, plays, and all the techniques of mass deception. Thomas Cromwell, was a master of mass deception. He then rewrote English history. He even fabricated it, and that was to suggest that England's history was not one of a European association, which had gone on for 1,000 years. It was a completely separate history. So he engaged scholars and he engaged legal experts to rewrite English history. Even found, and Kelly's been doing some very interesting work on this, that Joseph of Arimathea was meant to have come, I think under the guidance of St. Thomas, to England, establishing a direct connection from the apostles to England, not via Rome. And the final step in the process was keep repeating the message. So what we've got is this, one of the first examples of successful nation state building. Oh, by the way, I forgot to say that in establishing this, you create enemies. And in the case of the English, it was the Roman Catholics, which basically meant pretty much everyone in England. And Roman Catholics started to be seen as the Antichrist, the beast, the whore of Babylon. And not only that, they were masters of disguise. So it was extremely divisive, but horrifically, it was extremely successful. And you'd know things like the sacking of the monasteries and some of the horrors of what happened, including the beheadings and the hung, drawn, and quarters. So what we've got is a mythology that then was built on in the sense of the Thomas Cromwell's playbook of how to change a nation's mythology and institute a new powerful worldview and world vision, both of them based on stuff that simply wasn't true. Because, first of all, when the archaeologists went to the area, there's very little evidence in the archaeological record for any of the stuff in the Old Testament. I'm not an archaeologist, but what you read is there's very little evidence for any of what we're talking about in the Moses story actually having happened. So from a strict historical point of view, that was a myth, as in myth is not true. And this whole Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII playbook was also not true. The vision and the story of English history was simply not what happened. So we've got a myth, as in myth as lie, built on a myth, as in myth as lie, and yet it is appropriated by a powerful people, latter going to be appropriated by the American Puritans, and it became hugely influential. So in a way, this is to illustrate the power of myth-making, and myth-making when put into political, social, and cultural form with all the instruments of state power, as in violence and in policing and execution of or a punitive judicial system. You've actually got a very powerful form of myth-making. And why this is particularly relevant in terms of the story of the Irish stories is something we're going to hear when Tom picks that up after the break. But for now, what I'd like us to do is to go back into the small groups again and talk about national myth-making, and particularly the appropriation of this Old Testament mythology. And from what I understand, there was they used to read the Old Testament very attentively right through the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. So the Protestant agenda was very informed by an Old Testament sensibility. And then, as we said, it had huge impact in terms of English history, because any time we were in a situation of escape from, and it was escape from Europe, it was escape from the monarchy, in the case of the English Civil War, and in America's case, it was escape from England. And so what I'd like to do then is we go back into the small groups and just talk about these two things, the Moses story's underlying structure, and then the myth maker's playbook. Okay,